So here we are at the boardwalk. This is another section of our wetlands. It's still technically more a marsh than a swamp, but it's a little bit more treey here. Anyways, I picked this location because good drainage. And I want to show you this little lab we'll be doing. The idea is we're going to try to model how this wetland was able to form right next to the cliffs and right next to the canyon, and how each one became the way it is. So to represent the uplands, the places out of the water, we have a slanted board here. In this case, I didn't use a board. I had a piece of tin roofing metal, so I used that instead. You can basically use anything with a slant though. And I covered it in a mixture of clay, sand, pebbles, some rocks. I got these from the bottom of the creek, the swamp, the side of the hill, just a whole bunch of different dirts and mix them together because I want to have lots and lots of different sized particles. Now down at the bottom, to represent where the wetlands are, we have a trash can lid. Now the wetlands are just a place that holds water, a basin. So in this case, we just want something with a little bit of rim that will hold a little bit of water. And then to represent our rainfall or just moving water, we've got a bucket. This could also represent a creek or a river in this case. And the bucket has a little tiny hole in the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some water to the bucket. It's going to start draining slowly down the hillside, and it's going to get to our trash can lid. And we will just let it flow for a little while and see what happens. But before we start, just want to give you a good close look. See how this is all just sort of mixed together, kind of homogeneous, good vocab word. Nice, even distribution of muck. I need two hands for this next part. Okay, so we've got the water flowing. We are slowly eking out a bit of a trench, and it already needs to get refilled. Let's see if I can do this one-handed. Probably should use a slightly smaller hole in the bucket, but live and learn. So the processes we're talking about today are weathering, erosion, and deposition. And this model sort of shows you kind of all three. Now, first off is erosion. Erosion is not what most people seem to think it is. It's not hillsides breaking down and rocks becoming smaller rocks. Erosion is just the movement of little bits of material. And if you remember what this mud looked like when we started, it was a nice even layer. And you can see now the water has managed to take many of those particles away from up here at the top, making these nice little divots, canyons, pools all the way along our creek trail, and has transferred them to our basin. They haven't settled yet. These clay particles are really small and take a little while to go to the bottom, but they would eventually. Now, all of this movement, that's what erosion is. When the rocks actually break down into smaller rocks, which is not something that's really happening here if we're being honest. We had little bits of dirt and sand already. We're not breaking them down further. That's weathering. Weathering is the process of breaking rocks and other sediments down into smaller and smaller bits. Deposition, the last part, is when all the bits start settling. Now, if we look closely, you can see that the deposition that is occurring down here in the bottom, where the water is going really slow, we're depositing these little tiny clay particles, so small you can't hardly even see them. But if we look at what's been deposited inside of our riverbed, we have these bigger rocks. and sand particles mostly. Now, take a moment, pause the video, think, why would the sand and bigger rocks be up here in our riverbed, while down in the basin, all our clay particles gathered? While you're thinking, here's a interesting video of some live deposition happening. Ooh, good stuff. I guess you could also say there's some erosion happening on the right side of the screen, but I'm more looking at the particles stopping, the deposition part. Have you had enough time to think yet? Okay, let's stop. Okay, now that the flow's stopped for a bit, let's see what we got. Like I said, we've got these nice bigger rocks and chunks that are littering our riverbed of sorts. Now, these were already here technically, they just didn't move with the rest of the smaller particles when the water started flowing. That's because, as should make sense, bigger rocks are harder to move than smaller rocks. Bigger pieces of sediment are harder to move than smaller pieces of sediment. So, when you have a high energy environment, that is an environment where there's a lot of movement, in this case flow of water, larger particles are more likely to be deposited than smaller particles. And smaller particles are more prone to erosion, that is movement, than bigger particles. If we move to a low energy environment, somewhere where the water is not moving nearly as much, like our basin, then the smaller particles can also find themselves deposited. They slow down, they come to a stop, and then they can start working on sinking back down to the bottom of our basin, and that's where they're left. So, low energy environment, small particle deposition. High energy environment, large particle deposition. The more intuitive among you might have already thought, well wait, that just means it's sorting the particles by size. Smaller ones at the bottom, bigger ones up top. Yeah, pretty much. Good job. Sediment sorting is one of the side effects of erosion. But this also explains why in our swamp, which we are here at now, the sediment is clay, gooey, very fine particled mud mixed with organic matter of different sorts. Dead grasses and trees and branches and leaves and all that stuff. Whereas up in the canyon and on the hillside, we find a lot more sand and rocks. Those rocks and sand are a little bit harder to move than the clay, so they stay up there. When the rain washes down, it takes the small particles and puts them inside of the swamp, where they stay, because it's a low energy environment. Make sense? All right, so try to keep that all in the back of your mind, that weathering is the process of breaking down rocks and sediment into smaller pieces, that erosion is the process of moving the smaller pieces, or bigger pieces if you've got a very high energy environment, and deposition is the process of depositing pieces of sediment in a location of appropriate energy. All right. Now I'm afraid it's time to do a little bit of book learning.